welcome to another edition of Nevada Weekly. I'm Terry Knowlton with John Marshall. John, how are you feeling this morning?
I'm feeling a little plugged up, thank you.
We seem to be taking turns on that. I hope you're feeling better.
I hope to be better by next time.
What's up first this morning?
Terry, it's a matter of life and breath, as a matter of fact.
John, are we going to be talking about smoking?
We're not going to be talking about smoking, but some good friends of ours are. Dr. Joe Crowley, Vice President Bob Gorrell, Dr. Pasita Manolo, and Northern Nevada Chairman of the Great American Smokeout, Bob Rusk, are all going to be talking about the need to quit smoking on November 15th for that day, or perhaps forever.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pasita Manolo-Sears, who is an associate professor, doctor of laboratory medicine at the University Medical School. Also, Dr. Robert Gorrell, University Vice President. Pleasure to have you here with us today. And the President of the University of Nevada, Reno, Dr. Joe Crowley. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have amongst us a couple of ex-smokers, a recent pipe smoker who's not sure whether he's an ex-smoker or not, and a happy smoker. And between this awesome group, I think we should be able to have a good general discussion of what the Great American Smokeout is about. It's certainly to draw the attention to the general public, as we have for the past 3 years, to the idea of why anybody should consider that's a smoker giving up smoking. Going just briefly through some of the statistics, kind of interesting, the world tobacco consumption, again from 1978, 5 million tons were produced nationwide, which produced 4.2 trillion cigarettes, which is a lot of cigarettes. Americans and those in the advanced industrial nations smoke less because of high taxes and warnings that it is bad for your health. The world's emerging countries are smoking more. American cigarettes companies export under the government Food for Peace program. Throughout most of Africa, vendors are required by law to sell cigarettes individually rather than by the pack. And some of the isolated Sudanese towns, for example, where a young man might have an income of $200 a year, will spend 10 cents for the right to smoke a cigarette. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, takes the position that they're very much against cigarette smoking. They outlaw all advertising of cigarettes, and they restrict special areas where smokers are allowed to smoke. They insist that young people and health officials not smoke. China is the world's largest producer of cigarettes, has only recently begun to take the first steps in discouraging their young people from smoking. They, on the other hand, are in the export business, and at a recent trade show in the Philippines, they displayed 12 different brands that they plan on exporting worldwide. The Surgeon General's report came out in 1964, and now 15 years later, the updated report shows us some interesting things. Smoking among men in the United States has decreased significantly. It's remained virtually the same among women and gone up sharply with teenage girls. In fact, in 1964, teenage girls comprised about 8% of their population, and today they're with teenage boys at about 15%. So with 30% of our women smoking and 40% of the men, it's interesting. We might just get into the general conversation here and discussion of the effect from the standpoint clinically. Dr. Manolo, I know that you've brought some slides and some information regarding what a lung looks like and what it goes through as compared to a non-smoker.
Yes, I thought that if the individual is aware of the normal structure of the lung and what happens to some of this normal structure in heavy smokers, that this would be quite helpful in stopping from smoking. And here I've got the demonstration of a cross-section of a lung. Normally, this windpipe is lined by a certain type of epithelium which has this brush-like structure on the surface, which we refer to as cilia. And this acts as a filter for all the foreign material and dust that are normally inhaled by this individual. And when one coughs, all these material that were caught in this cilia are expelled from the lung, and that prevents it, you know, from settling down in the lower portion of the lung. And individuals who are heavy smokers, the first thing that is affected is this cilia, and so they're lost, and so which means that you also lost the filtering capacity of this epithelium.
Now, what about a smoker who makes the decision one day to give up smoking? Is that lung going to improve as a non-smoker?
Yes. The sequence of event is after the loss of this cilia, eventually the whole thickness of this epithelium is also lost. And afterwards, in order to compensate, there is a regeneration of this epithelium. But then the regenerated epithelium is a different type of epithelium that the normal has. It is squamous type of epithelium. And it stays like that. And if this continues on, there will be an uncontrolled increase in the number of cells, and this is what gives rise to the carcinoma. There is uncontrollable growth both towards the lumen of the pipes, the windpipes, and also towards the wall of the bronchus and into the lung tissue.
So there is a regeneration.
But, yes, that's the bad part of it.
Okay.
But then if you stop smoking, then this replacement eventually will be towards the normal epithelium. And this has been proven. I participated in a study in Illinois where, in a cancer screening program, where we screened about 1,000 heavy smokers. No symptoms, no signs of tumor by chest x-ray, and we just collected sputum from these patients. And about 95% of the heavy smokers showed some kind of change in the cells that were extruded from these windpipes. But then the same patients were followed through afterwards, and the ones that stopped smoking showed the normal epithelium afterwards.
And what period of time afterwards did that materialize?
Well, according to statistics, it takes from about 3 to 10 years.
I see.
You may show improvement depending on what type of injury it had done initially.
Okay, now this is a bit of earth-shaking news that I'll just lay on this group. You probably didn't know who the non-smoker of the year was this past year. It was Prince Charles from England. And the reason for that was that, and this was awarded by the National Society of Non-Smokers, he refused to allow his fellow guests to smoke until the end of a recent dinner party. Now, we'll give him all the plaudits necessary for those of us that are non-smokers. But bringing us right down to the bottom line of what we're talking about here, we've got a happy smoker in our midst. Dr. Crowley, give us your feelings on how you deal with smokers and non-smokers.
I'm not sure that it's accurate, Bob, to describe me as a happy smoker. It would be appropriate to say that I enjoy smoking, which is why it has been so difficult for me to quit. I can recall a period in my life when I was a heavy smoker and an unhappy smoker at the same time, and several times over the course of the years made an effort to quit the habit, and succeeded for periods of 4 months to 6 months to a year, and eventually rationalized my way back into it, and finally decided, I guess about 18 years ago, that if I was going to smoke, I was not going to smoke very much. And so cut down to, I think at that time, 3 or 4 cigarettes a day. Over the years, I guess I have gradually worked my way up back to 7 or 8. Most days, there are some days when I exceed that. But those are cigarettes, I guess you could say, that I enjoy. Previously, I would smoke every hour on the hour, every half hour on the half hour, or what. Just couldn't wait to light up, but didn't enjoy most of them. So it's only in that sense you could describe me as a happy smoker. I'd be delighted to quit, and I have told myself and my children, who pressure me relentlessly, that one day soon I will. And I still say that. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know. But I certainly do understand that it's unhealthy. That in part, I guess, is what has led me to cut down drastically. But that in itself may be a danger. I mean, you may feel that since you don't smoke much, it's not dangerous for you. I think, no doubt, to the extent you smoke, it is dangerous.
Dr. Gorrell, what's
I'm just looking at Dr. Manalo-Sears' pictures and wondering what state my lungs are in. I think I smoked a pipe for at least 40 years whenever I sat down, but I never felt that I was addicted to smoking, and obviously I was in one way or another, and maybe still am, although with me it's at least in considerable measure a nervous habit. And I have at least a recipe for stopping. I don't know whether this is going to work, but I picked up a flu virus about a month or 6 weeks ago, and I didn't feel like smoking, and curiously just haven't started again. And I don't know that I will. One of the side advantages, quite apart of whatever it's doing or not doing to my lungs, is that I discover that I've quit burning holes in my trousers, and I don't have to empty tobacco and ashes out of my pockets every evening, and there's some advantage in not having to collect all the materials all the time.
Have there been any comments from family, friends?
Oh yes. Well, in general, everyone tells me how great it is that I've made this great sacrifice, and the fact is that I haven't thought much about it at all.
I understand. I understand that it only takes one cigarette for the smoker who just quit to get back into the smoking habit again. Is that true?
I don't know. I've never smoked cigarettes.
Well, in a way it is. When I quit, and I did, as I said, several times, eventually I would pick something up, a cigar or a pipe, and because those were not as dangerous, and I didn't inhale them, and so I would smoke them for a while. This was the typical quitting experience for me. I would get to the point, usually ended up with pipes because I just couldn't tolerate cigars, nor could my wife, nor my clothes. And so I would end up with pipes, which have a pleasant smell about them, I guess. And I would reach a point where I would begin to inhale the pipe tobacco. And then I would say to myself, boy, that really is dangerous, because inhaling pipe tobacco is worse than inhaling cigarette tobacco. So I'm far better off if I go back to cigarettes, and that was the typical pattern. I would then light up a cigarette. It would taste perfectly awful, the first one. But the urge was reinvigorated, and the first would inevitably lead to the second, which would still taste bad, but not as bad as the first, and the third was better than the second, and so on. I have no way of knowing whether my experience is typical, but I think it likely that the first one you take after a long period of abstaining is not going to delight you too much, but it does do something to you psychologically or internally that leads you to the next one.
This is the year of the child. We've heard that many times over. And certainly the most successful non-smoker is the one that never starts. I don't think I've ever talked to somebody that's really serious about their health and well-being that doesn't say much as you say, I really would like to give it up. And they have mixed degrees of success in accomplishing that.
Mark Twain, remember, said it was easy. He'd done it 100 times.
Exactly. So with the, well, let's start right at the beginning. Let me review just, there's a good little pamphlet, in fact, out that the American Cancer Society has, answers to the most often asked questions about cigarette smoking and lung cancer. It's available here at the local agency. But they point out here the dangers for women while pregnant, which is, it's earth-shaking, just a couple of things. Recent evidence links smoking while pregnant to stillbirths, increased mortality among newborns. Low birth weight is apparently a standard sort of thing. You can plan on a child being smaller at the point of coming into the world. Nicotine restricts blood vessels and breathing movements of unborn babies and women who smoke, while carbon monoxide reduces the oxygen level of their blood. So, you know, this is serious. There is no question of that. And yet, it isn't hard to see a lady that's obviously pregnant smoking a cigarette. And it's just as if they must not be aware. It's difficult to deal with that. Children in the early years in school now, your experience at home with your kids coming home and expressing themselves. I see that in my kids and their peers. Really, they give as much problem to parents who smoke as anybody. And I think it's a good, healthy trend. Mm-hmm. This has been a delightful opportunity for me, and I appreciate very much the three of you taking the time to join us today to discuss a subject that, Joe, you're representing 75 million people here today.
Oh, probably not very well.
And the rest of us in the 60% or so group will continue to deal with this problem. And I think we're making progress in the area that most people agree, and that is that we can smoke less and we're better for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nevada's First Lady, Kathy List, recently spoke to a local Seroptimist group about her role as chairperson of Nevada's International Year of the Child campaign. She talked about what was going on in the International Year of the Child nationwide and explained that the major concern throughout the country is the subject of child abuse.
And we have certainly sufficient reason in this state to be concerned about the topic, because statistics tell us that Nevada has the highest rate of child abuse of any state in the Union. Nevada Weekly wanted to address that issue and brought together some concerned citizens, a pediatrician, a juvenile courtmaster, assemblyman and professor of journalism. Nevada Weekly's reporter, Norma Lindeberg, introduces them.
Steve Colter, Assemblyman and U.N.R. Professor of Journalism, discussed the role of local, state, and national programs dealing with child abuse with Charles Springer, Juvenile Court Master of Washoe County, and Dr. Robert Bensel, Pediatrician and Professor in the School of Public Health in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota.
Dr. Nevada ranks 4th in the nation per capita on the number of child abuse cases. In the last 2 years, the number of child abuse cases have doubled in the state to over about 2,200, I believe it was. Is this indicative of the trend nationally?
Yes, throughout the United States, there are more and more cases being reported of child abuse. The latest national data we have is 1977. About 750,000 children have been reported for suspected child abuse and neglect. And I think the experts who look at this say that it is both better reporting because of laws. There is a considerable amount of data that says there's more abuse cases because there's more stress on families. Every time the country goes through a recession, this puts more economic stress, and some of that frustration may come out upon the children.
Of course, historically, child abuse is nothing new. It goes back a long time.
That's correct. One of my special interests is looking at the historical roots, and the last 4,000 years in Western culture has been a history, really, of abuse and neglect of children. We moved out of an era of infanticide where parents actually, and condoned by society, killed their children, to where children were abandoned. We saw society respond by orphanages, foundling care institutions. We've gone through a period of child labor in this country that put children to work, and finally children got more rights in those areas. And it's kind of interesting that we're in a current phase, really starting last 100 years, of being aware in society about abuse and neglect, and particularly since 1961, when the term battered child syndrome was coined by Dr. Kemp in Denver, kind of brought a lot of public awareness to the issue. We created, in a way, a new kind of awareness in society that there was an issue called child abuse and neglect.
Of course, child abuse is not just a problem of the family, it's a social problem, and that's where the court system comes in. Mr. Springer, you are the juvenile court master in Washoe County. How do you view the situation from your perspective?
Well, what I see is a situation that's completely consistent with what Dr. Bensel is saying. I'm getting now where I can identify children who are accused of violent crimes before I even read their social history. I know that these children have been abused, have been neglected, have been consciously rejected. I think there's one point that is worthy of emphasis, and that is that we're not necessarily restricting ourselves to physical abuse. Physical abuse has definite consequences. It teaches violence, it lowers self-esteem, it makes it difficult for a child to have a trusting relationship with anyone. It makes them resist authority. But this isn't the only part of it. A child who is rejected and constantly put down, verbal abuse, emotionally abused children have pretty much the same type of reaction. And one way of putting it is that we know how to create violent criminals in this country, and we're doing a very good job of doing it. And I might add this, that we're doing it on an expanded level, that we seem to be creating more of these children who in turn become parents who again abuse their children, and we have to do something to interrupt this flow, this cycle, and if we don't, we're going to have more serious social problems than we have now.
One of the interesting statistics that's come up in hearings before the Nevada Legislative Subcommittee studying child abuse is that there is an increased frequency of parents being abused by their children. They abused their children when they were very young. The children grow up to become teenagers and end up abusing the parents. And I think there's a statistic of like 2,000 parents each year are killed by their own children.
Well, they've learned violence. The old expression, the father saying to his 10-year-old son, "I'll teach you to beat up on your 6-year-old brother." Well, that's exactly what he's doing, is teaching violence. And I think from my perspective, this type of violence, I'm talking about excessive abuse, physically and emotionally, I'm seeing a lot more of it than I would have thought was present had I not had the opportunity to be sitting on the juvenile court.
I think our dimensions of it are changing constantly, which is confusing to the lay public, is that we have an entity called child abuse, which is now related to the whole question of battered wives syndrome and battered husbands. People are looking at the elderly, the fact that the elderly can become victims of abuse or verbal abuse also. So that we have a widening dimension now. Some people call this whole field inter-family violence that takes place in the family. And so the other big issue is the sexual area. We've talked about long-term outcomes physically. I think that there's a huge toll we take psychologically. People are starting to correlate, why are 30% of the population mentally ill? And again, it goes back to some of these same factors of trusting other people, knowing what's right and what's wrong. How do you behave in a society? They may all have common roots in abuse and neglect of children.
In Nevada, one statistic that's come out, the 140 children that are in the 2 state children's homes, 20% of those have been sexually or physically abused, which would indicate along this trend.
I would think the figure would be higher.
That's right.
So what's the solution?
What's the solution? Very tough question. I guess where I'm coming from is a public health approach, that prevention is better than cure. I think that public awareness to the issues, public discussion of the issues, support services to intervene in those families that have problems, the society giving people permission to say, I am an abuser, I need help. Just like AA, we have groups called Parents Anonymous or COPE. How do we help parents to take advantage of these kind of self-help groups? How the systems relate, how do social services relate? And I think one of the important things that needs to be mentioned, that most of the case reports in a community come from friends, relatives, and neighbors. They know what's going on inside the family, that the welfare department, there is a number you can call if you have a concern. And I think that's important to realize, to bring it out in the open and deal with it. The same way we dealt with alcohol. We didn't keep alcohol in the closet. We brought it out, we discussed it. We developed treatment programs and preventative programs. So I think alcohol model is a good model to look at for a community, and there's a whole wide range of services that need to be coordinated within a community.
Saying coming out of the closet, though, is not an easy thing to do. How does a person say, hey, I'm a bad parent, I don't know how to take care of my children, and come out publicly?
Well, as I
That's
said, we
hard
did
to
it with
do.
alcohol. I mean, if you look back 15, 20 years ago, nobody would say I'm having trouble with alcohol or I'm having any kinds of problems. And we know we rounded that corner. And I do see parents now who do have permission to say, I've had some difficulty. I think the general society cannot punish parents. I mean, if we take the attitude of punishing parents, that there's a lot of professionals, including myself, who say, well, how much am I going to report cases if our position is not one of support, generally of support. Now you cross a line where the abuse is bad and there needs to be, you know, further legal intervention, obviously, in families. But in general, most of the cases of child abuse and neglect can be handled within the family with good support services.
Mr. Springer, how do you see the problem?
Well, I see, I would trace a lot of this to ignorance on the part of parents of the terrible toll that's being taken by the abuse of children. Not only are we creating criminals, we're creating a lot of maladjusted, unhappy people. And I prefer to think that if a lot of these parents knew how destructive they were being to their own children, they might change. I believe with Dr. Bensel, first in prevention, by education, by early intervention. I believe that we should use the mass media, television, maybe simulcast so everyone has to pay attention, maybe parenting courses. But now we finally have the means to know the terrible mistakes that we're making in child raising, and I don't think that this knowledge is being adequately communicated to the public, and I would like to see at least that done. That's feasible. That doesn't cost a lot of money.
If you have information dealing with child abuse in Washoe County, the number to call would be 785-5611. That's the Washoe County Welfare Department.
2 lectures on November 13th and December 11th also address the topic of child abuse. And they are sponsored by the Center for Religion and Life and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Both lectures will be held at the Judicial College building.
I'm Bob Rusk, chairman of the Great American Smokeout, November 15. I'd like to introduce you to my friend Oscar. I think it's quite obvious that Oscar would never quit. On the other hand, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the mayors of Reno and Sparks, Mayors Bennett and Player. They've agreed to join us November 15th by giving up smoking, signing the pledge, and throwing their cigarettes out. Won't you, the smoking public of Washoe County, consider November 15, throwing out your weed and accepting the challenge of no more smoking.
We hope to join us again 2 weeks from this morning. Same time, same place, KOLO TV, Reno.
John and I wish you a beautiful day.